Hello, patrons. Thank you again for your patronage. This is a story by Richard Malden, and it's called Between Sunset and Moonrise. During the early part of last year, it fell to me to act as executor for an old friend. Now, we'd not seen much of each other in recent years because he'd been living in the west of England and my own time had been fully occupied elsewhere. The time of our intimacy had been when he was the vicar of a large parish not very far from Cambridge. I will call it Yaxholme, although that is not his name. Now, the place had seemed to suit him thoroughly. He'd been on the best of terms with his parishioners and with the few gentry of the neighbourhood, and the church itself suited a custodian of antiquarian knowledge and artistic perception, in which respects, too, my friend was particularly well qualified for the position. But a sudden nervous breakdown had compelled him to resign. Now, the cause of this had always been a mystery to his friends. I mean, he was barely middle-aged when it took place, and he'd always given the appearance of being a man of robust good health. I mean, his parish was neither particularly laborious nor harassing, and as far as was known to us, he had no special secret anxieties of any kind. But the collapse came with startling suddenness and was so severe that for a time his reason seemed to be in danger. And although 2 years of rest and travel enabled him to lead a normal life again, he was never the man that he had been. He never revisited his old parish or any of his friends in the county. And he seemed to become very ill at ease if conversation ever turned upon the part of England in which it lay. I mean, it was perhaps not unnatural that he should dislike the place which had cost him so much. But his friends could not but regard as childish the length to which he carried his aversion. He'd had a distinguished career at the university, and he'd kept up his intellectual interests in later life. But except for an occasional well-respected contribution to a learned periodical, he'd published nothing. Now, I was not without hope of finding something among his papers which would secure for him a permanent place in the world of learning, but in this I was disappointed. I mean, his literary remains were copious enough, and that they bore a striking testimony to the vigour and range of his intellect, but they were fragmentary. There was nothing which could be made fit for wider circulation, except perhaps one document. It's a letter addressed to me. Now, I would have been happy to suppress or at least ignore this myself, but my friend had left particular instructions in his will that it was to be publicly shared when he had been dead for 1 year. It was dated 2 years after he'd left Yaxholme and nearly 5 before his death. And, well, I offer it to you tonight without any further comment. So, my friend writes, "Dear Richard, the solicitude which you have displayed me during my illness has placed me under obligations which I cannot hope to repay. I feel, however, that I owe it to you to explain, or to try to explain, the real cause of my breakdown. I've never spoken of it before to anyone, for had I done so, it would have been impossible to avoid questions which I would not wish to be able to answer. Nothing but a lively sense of what I owe to you could have enabled me to undergo the pain of recalling the experience which I am now about to set down. Yaxholme lies, as you will remember, upon the extreme edge of the Fen district. In shape, it is a long oval with a main line of railway cutting one end. The church and vicarage are close to the station, and round them lies a village containing nearly 5/6 of the entire population of the parish. On the other side of the line, the Fen proper begins and stretches for many miles. Now, although it is now fertile cornland, much of it had been permanently underwater within living memory, and it would soon revert to its original condition if it were not for the pumping stations. And in spite of these, it was not unusual to see several hundred of acres flooded in winter. My own parish ran for nearly 6 miles, and I had several farms and cottages scattered so far from the village that a visit to them took up the whole of a long afternoon. Most of them were not on any road and could only be reached by droves. Now, for the benefit of those who are not acquainted with the Fens, a drove, I should probably explain here, is a very imperfect sketch of the idea of a road. It's usually bounded by hedges or dikes so that the traveller cannot actually lose his way, but it offers no further assistance to his progress. The middle is often simply a grass track, and as cattle have to be driven along it, the mud is sometimes literally knee deep in the winter, and in summer the light peaty soil rises in clouds of sable dust. I remember my friend telling me in happier times that he seldom went down a drove without recalling Hesiod's unpatriotic description of his native village in Boeotia. Bad in winter, intolerable in summer, good at no time. But to continue. At the far end of one of these droves, my friend continues, lay a straggling group of half a dozen cottages, of which the most remote was occupied by an old woman whom I will call Mrs. Vries. Now, in some ways, she was the most interesting of all my parishioners, and she was certainly the most perplexing. She was not a native, but she'd come to live there some 20 years before, and it was hard to see what had tempted a stranger to so unattractive a spot. It was the last house in the parish. Her nearest neighbour was a quarter of a mile away, and she was fully 3 miles from a hard road or a shop. The house itself was not at all a good one either. It had been unoccupied, I was told, for some years before Mrs. Vries came to it, and she'd found it in a semi-ruinous condition. And yet, you see, I don't think she'd been driven to seek so cheap a dwelling by poverty. She had a good supply of furniture of the highest quality, and apparently as much money as she required to live without working. She never gave the slightest hint as to where she'd come from or what her previous history had been, and as far as was known, she never wrote or received any letters. She must have been between 50 and 60 years old when she came to Yaxholm, and her appearance was striking. She was tall and thin, with an aquiline nose, a pair of very brilliant dark eyes, and a quantity of hair, snow white, by the time that I knew her. At one time she must have been a handsome woman, but she'd grown rather forbidding. And I used to think that a couple of centuries before, she might have had some difficulty in proving that she was not a witch. Although her neighbours not unnaturally fought rather shy of her, her conversation showed that she was a clever woman who had at some time clearly received a good deal of education and had lived in cultivated surroundings. I used to think that she must have been an upper servant, perhaps a lady's maid in a good house. And, well, despite the ring on her finger, I always suspected that the missus was brevet rank. Anyway, one New Year's Eve, I thought it my duty to visit Mrs. Vries. I had not seen her for some months, and a few days of frost had made the drove more passable than it had been for several weeks. But you see, in spite of her interesting personality, I always found it required a considerable moral effort on my part to call at her cottage. She was always civil, and she expressed herself pleased to see me, but I could never get rid of the idea that she regarded civility to me in the light of an insurance which might be claimed elsewhere. I tried to tell myself that such thoughts were unfounded and unworthy, that they were really due to personal pique, because I could never discover that she had any religion, nor could I instill any into her, and the fault was more mine than hers. But you see, I could never repress these thoughts altogether. And whenever I left her cottage, it was inevitably with a strong feeling that I'd no desire to ever see her again. On this particular afternoon, the prospect of seeing Mrs. Rees seemed more than usually distasteful, and my disinclination increased curiously as I made my way along the drove. In fact, so strong did it become as I walked that if any reasonable excuse for turning back had presented itself, I'm afraid that I would have seized it. None did, however, so I held on, comforting myself with the thought that I should begin the new year with a comfortable sense of having discharged the most unpleasant of my regular duties in a conscientious fashion. When I reached the cottage, I was a little surprised at having to knock 3 times, and by hearing the sound of bolts being cautiously drawn back. But presently the door opened, and Mrs. Rees peered out. Now, as soon as she saw who it was, she made me very welcome, as usual, but it was impossible not to feel that she had been expecting some other visitor, someone that she was not so anxious to see. She volunteered no statement, however, and I thought it better to pretend to have noticed nothing unusual. On a table in the middle of the room lay a large book which she had obviously just been reading, and I was surprised to see that it was a Bible, and as it lay open at the book of Tobit. Now, seeing that I'd noticed it, Mrs. Rees told me, with a little hesitation, I thought, that she had been reading the story of Sarah and the fiend Asmodeus. And then, the ice broken, she plied me almost fiercely with questions. To what cause did I attribute Sarah's obsession in the first instance? Did the efficacy of Tobias's remedy depend upon its having been prescribed by an angel? And many other questions of the same effect. Now, I'm afraid that my answers were, by necessity, rather vague, and Mrs. Rees's good manners could not conceal her disappointment. She sat silent for a minute or two while I looked at her. Not, I must confess, without some alarm, because her manner had been very strange. And then she said abruptly, "Will you have some tea with me?" Well, I assented gladly, because it was nearly 4:30, and it would take me nearly an hour and a half to get home. She took some time over the preparations, and during the meal, she talked with more fluency than usual. I couldn't help thinking she was trying to make my visit last as long as possible. Finally, at about 5:30, however, I rose and said that I must go, as I had many other odds and ends awaiting me at home. I held out my hand, and as she took it, I said, "Mrs. Rees, you must let me wish you a very happy new year." She stared at me for a moment, and then broke into a harsh laugh and said, "Ha! If wishes were horses, beggars might ride. Still, I thank you for your goodwill." Now, about 30 yards from her house, there was an elbow in the drove, and when I reached this, I looked back, and I saw that Mrs. Rees was still standing in her doorway, her figure sharply silhouetted against the red glow of the kitchen fire. For an instant, the play of shadow made it look as if there were another, taller figure behind her. But the illusion passed. I waved my hand to her and turned the corner. Now, it was a fine, still, starlit night, and I reflected that the moon would be up before I reached home, and that my walk back would not be at all an unpleasant one. I'd naturally been rather puzzled by Mrs. Rees's behaviour, and I decided that I must see her again before long to ascertain whether, as seemed possible, her mind was giving way. When I'd passed the other cottages of the group, I noticed that the stars were disappearing, and a thick white mist was now rolling up. But this didn't trouble me. The drove now ran straight until it joined the high road, and there was no turn into it on either side. There was no chance that I'd lose my way. And anyone who lives in the Fens for any length of time is accustomed to fogs. But the fog soon grew very thick, and I gradually grew conscious of that creepy feeling which a really thick fog can inspire. I've been thinking of various things in somewhat desultory fashion, when suddenly, and it was almost as if it had been whispered into my ear, a passage from the Book of Wisdom came into my mind and refused to be dislodged. Now, my nerves were perfectly sound at that time, and I had walked up many a lonely drove in a fog before. But just at that moment, I would have preferred to have recalled almost anything else, because this was the extract which my memory was pleased to present to me. It's from chapter 17, verses 4 to 6. You'll doubtless recognize it. For neither did the dark recesses that held them guard them from fears, but sounds rushing down rang around them, and phantoms appeared, cheerless with unsmiling faces, and no force of fire prevailed to give them light, neither were the brightest flames of the stars strong enough to illumine that gloomy night, and in terror they deemed the things which they saw to be worse than that sight on which they could not gaze, and they lay helpless, made the sport of magic art. Suddenly I heard a loud snort as of a beast at my elbow. I jumped, and I stood for a moment to avoid blundering into a stray cow. But there was nothing there. The next moment I heard what sounded like a low chuckle. Now, this was more disconcerting, but common sense soon came to my aid. I told myself that the cow must have been on the other side of the hedge and not really so close as it had seemed to be, and what I had taken for a chuckle must have been the squelching of her feet in a soft place. But I must confess, I did not find that explanation as convincing as I would have wished. I plodded on, but soon I became unaccountably tired. Now, I say unaccountably because I was a good walker and often covered much more ground than I had done that day. I slackened my pace, but as I was not out of breath, that did nothing to relieve me. I felt as if I were wading through water up to my middle, or through very deep, soft snow. And at last, I was fairly compelled to stop. Now, by that time, I admit I was thoroughly uneasy, wondering what could the matter with me be. But as I had nearly 2 miles still to go, there was nothing for it but to push on as best I could. And I started again. I saw that although I could not feel a breath of air, the fog seemed to be beginning to clear. But instead of thinning in the ordinary way, it merely rolled back a little on either hand, producing an effect that I'd never seen before. Along the sides of the drove now lay 2 solid banks of white, with a narrow passage clear between them. The passage seemed to stretch for an interminable distance, and at the far end I perceived a number of figures. Now, I say perceived advisedly rather than saw, because I do not know whether I saw them in the ordinary sense of the word or not. That is to say, I did not know then, and have never been able to determine since, whether it was still dark. I only know that my power of vision seemed now to be independent of light or darkness. I perceived the figures as one sees the creatures of a dream, or the mental pictures which sometimes come when one is neither quite asleep nor awake. They are advancing rapidly in an orderly fashion, almost like a body of troops. In fact, the scene recalled very vividly a picture of the Israelites marching across the Red Sea between two perpendicular walls of water in a set of Bible pictures that I'd had as a child. Now, I've not thought of that picture for more than 30 years, but now it leapt into my mind and I found myself saying aloud, yes, of course, it must have been exactly like that. How glad I am to have seen it. Now, I suppose it's the interest of making that comparison that kept me from feeling the surprise which would otherwise have been occasioned by meeting a large number of people marching down a lonely drove towards one after dark on a raw December evening. At first, I would have said there were 30 or 40 in the party, but when they'd drawn a little nearer, they seemed to be no more than 10 or a dozen strong. A moment later, I saw to my surprise that they were reduced to 5 or 6. The advancing figures seemed to be melting into one another, something after the fashion of dissolving views. Their speed and stature increased as their numbers diminished, suggesting that the survivors had, in some horrible fashion, absorbed their companions. Now there appear to be only 3. And then one solitary figure of gigantic stature, rushing down the drove towards me at fearful pace. He made no sound, but as he came, the mist closed behind him so that his dark figure was thrown up against a solid background of white, much as mountain climbers are said sometimes to see their own shadow upon a bank of cloud. On and on he came until at last he towered above me and I saw his face. Now, it has come to me once or twice since in dreams, that face. It may come again, I suppose, but I'm thankful that I've never had any clear picture of it in my waking moments. If I had, I would be afraid for my reason. I only know that the impression which it produced upon me was that of intense malignity, long baffled and now at last within reach of its desire. I believe that I screamed out loud, and then, after a pause which seemed to last for hours, the thing broke over me like a wave. There was a rushing and a screaming all round me, and I struck out with my hands as if I was swimming. The sensation was not unlike that of rising from a deep dive. There was the same feeling of pressure and suffocation, but in this case, coupled with the most intense physical loathing. The only comparison which I can suggest is that I felt as a man might feel if he were buried beneath a heap of worms or toads. But suddenly I seemed to be clear, and I fell forward on my face. I'm not sure I fainted or not, although I must have lain there for some minutes. When I picked myself up, I felt a light breeze on my forehead, and the mist was clearing away as quickly as it had come. I saw the rim of the moon above the horizon, and my mysterious fatigue had disappeared. I hurried forward as quickly as I could, without venturing to look behind me. I wanted only to get out of that abominable drove and onto the high road where there were lights and other human beings, because I knew that what I had seen was a creature of darkness and waste places, and that among my fellows I should be safe. When I reached home, I housekeeper looked at me oddly. I mean, of course, my clothes were muddy and disarranged, but I suspect that there was also something unusual in my appearance. I just told her that I'd had a fall coming up a drove in the dark and that I was not feeling particularly well. I avoided the looking glass when I went to my room to change. Coming downstairs, I heard through the open kitchen door some scraps of conversation, or rather of a monologue delivered by my housekeeper, to the effect that no one ought to be about the droves after dark as often as I was, and that it was a providence that things were no worse. Her own mother's uncle had, it appeared, been down just such another drove on just such another night 42 years ago, come next Christmas Eve. They brought him home in a barrow with both his eyes drawn down and every drop of blood in his body turned. But he never would speak of what he see, and wild cats couldn't have scratched it out of him. I spent the next day in bed. When I got up on the second day, I was not surprised to hear that Mrs. Vries had been found dead the previous afternoon. I'd hardly finished breakfast when I was told that a policeman, his name was Winter, would be glad to speak to me. It appeared that on New Year's morning, a half-witted boy of 17 who lived at one of the other cottages down the drove had come to the policeman and said that Mrs. Vries was dead and that he must come and enter her house. He declined to explain how he had come by the information, so at first Mr. Winter contented himself by pointing out that it was the 1st of January, not the 1st of April. But the boy was so insistent that he finally went. When repeated knockings at Mrs. Vries's cottage door produced no result, he had felt justified in forcing the back door. She was sitting in a large wooden armchair, leaning forward a little, and her hands were clasping the arms so tightly that it proved to be a matter of some difficulty to unloose her fingers. In front of her was another chair, so close that if anyone had been sitting in it, his knees must have touched those of the dead woman. The seat cushions were flattened down, as if it had been recently occupied. There was no suspicion of foul play, as all the doors and windows were securely fastened on the inside. Winter added that her face had made him feel quite sickish-like, and that the house smelled very bad, for all that it was so clean. A post-mortem examination of the body showed that Mrs. Vries's heart was in a very bad state, and it enabled the coroner's jury to return a verdict of death from natural causes. But the doctor told me privately that she must have had a shock of some kind. In fact, he said, if anyone ever died of fright, that woman did. But goodness knows what could have frightened her in her own kitchen, unless it was her conscience. But well, Vicar, that's more in your line than mine. He added that he'd found the examination of the body particularly trying, although he could not or would not say why. As I was the last person to have seen her alive, I attended the inquest, but gave only formal evidence of an unimportant character. I didn't mention that the second armchair had stood in the corner of the room during my visit, and that I had not occupied it. The boy was, of course, called and asked how he knew that Mrs. Vries was dead, but nothing satisfactory could be got from him. He said only that there were right houses and there was wrong houses, and that they had been after her for a long time. When asked who he meant by they, he declined to explain, merely adding as a general statement that he could see further into a milestone than what some people could, for all that they call themselves so clever. His own family deposed that he had been absolutely silent, contrary to his usual custom, from tea time on New Year's Eve to breakfast time the next day, and then he'd suddenly announced that Mrs. Vries was dead, and then run out of the house before they could say anything to him. Accordingly, he was dismissed by the coroner with a warning to the effect that persons who were disrespectful to constituted authorities always came to a bad end. It naturally fell to me to conduct the funeral. I could give no reason to refuse a Christian burial. Now, the coffin was not particularly weighty, but as it was being lowered into the grave, the ropes surrounding it parted and it fell several feet with a thud. Now, this shock dislodged a quantity of soil from the sides of the cavity so that the coffin was completely covered before I had had time to say, earth to earth, ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Afterwards, the sexton spoke to me apologetically about this occurrence. I'm fair put out about it, sir, about them ropes. Nothing of that sort ever happened afore in my time. They are pretty nigh new, too, and I thought they'd done us for years. But look here, sir. And then he showed me two extraordinarily ravelled ends. I never seen a rope like that before. Almost looks as if it had been scratted through by a big cat or something. That was the night that I fell ill. When I was better, my doctor said that rest and change of scene were imperative, but I knew that I could never go down a drove again by night, so I tendered my resignation to the bishop. I hope that I still have a few years of usefulness left to me, but I know that I can never be as I hadn't, as if I'd not seen what I'd seen. I mean, whether I met my adventure through some fault of my own, I don't know. But of one thing I am sure. There are powers of darkness which walk abroad in waste places, and that man is happy who's never had to face them. Oh, my dear Richard, you who have treated me so kindly and with such patience, I pray that you yourself may never have such an experience as mine. But if you do, and if you should feel tempted to investigate it further, please consider first the counsel of Jesus ben Sira. My son, seek not things that are too hard for thee, and search not out things that are above thy strength. Goodbye, my dear friend. And thank you again for all that you have done.